The sky above the English Channel in 1943 burned with light. Searchlights clawed upward, their beams intersecting in frantic grids. Anti-aircraft guns barked, the thunder rolling across cities already shrouded in blackout. Shells streaked into the dark, bursting in angry blossoms of fire. German bombers droned overhead, their engines a deep, menacing hum. And on the ground, soldiers and civilians alike tilted their faces upward, praying the storm of flak would find its mark. Most of the time it didn't. During the Blitz and in battles across the Pacific, anti-aircraft artillery faced a brutal truth. Hitting an aircraft in flight was next to impossible. Guns fired thousands of rounds for every confirmed kill. Sometimes entire batteries would empty their magazines into the sky, and a single bomber would still fly home, riddled, but alive. The mathematics of war were merciless. A shell with a contact fuse had to strike the aircraft directly to detonate. A timed fuse had to be set perfectly. Fractions of a second mattered. Miss by even a hair, and the shell exploded harmlessly in empty air. Gunners grew frustrated. Commanders despaired. For all the industrial might poured into anti-aircraft defense, the return on investment seemed pitiful. One statistic became legendary. In the early war, British gunners sometimes needed 20,000 shells to bring down a single plane. Every near miss was still a miss. And in modern war, near misses were worthless. But what if near misses could count? What if a shell could explode, not when it touched a target, not when a timer ticked down, but the moment it came close? Close enough that fragments would tear wings, shred control cables, smash engines. That was the radical dream of the proximity fuse. The idea was deceptively simple. Build a tiny radio system inside the nose of a shell. Let it transmit a signal. When that signal bounced back from an aircraft, the change in frequency, the Doppler shift, would tell the fuse that a target was near. In that instant, the circuit would fire, detonating the explosive charge. The shell would not need to hit. It would only need to come within a lethal radius. The challenge was staggering. A fuse no bigger than a fist had to contain a complete radio transmitter, receiver, oscillator, battery, and trigger tube. It had to survive being fired from a cannon, enduring forces of up to 20,000 times the pull of gravity. It had to function despite spinning tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, and it had to wait, arming only after it had cleared the gun barrel, before it could detonate. To scientists, it was like asking a vacuum tube to ride a rocket and then perform surgery at the top of its arc. The story began in Britain, where radar itself had already changed the war. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment sketched circuits that might make a shell see its target. But the British lacked the industrial scale and ruggedized electronics to make the idea real. So between in 1940, as part of the Tizard mission, they handed the concept to America. It was one of the most consequential acts of scientific cooperation in history. In the United States, the National Defense Research Committee seized the idea. Section T, led by physicist Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, took charge. Tuve was brilliant, blunt, and relentless. He recruited a team of engineers who understood not only electronics but the brutal realities of war. Their task, shrink radar to the size of a Coke bottle and make it survive an artillery shot. They faced problem after problem. Vacuum tubes shattered under acceleration. Batteries died too soon or failed to activate in flight. Circuits shorted when shells spun. Time and again, prototypes failed on test ranges, but Tuve drove his team mercilessly. "We will make it work," he insisted. "There is no alternative." At last, in late 1942, a prototype survived its birth. Testers fired shells over Chesapeake Bay, and for the first time, a fuse detonated not by contact, not by clock, but by presence. A drone aircraft flying overhead was struck by fragments from a near miss. Observers cheered. The dream had become reality. Secrecy cloaked the project immediately. The weapon was too valuable, too revolutionary, to risk falling into German or Japanese hands. Even its name was disguised. Official documents called it the VT fuse, variable time, masking its true nature. Only a handful of officers understood what those letters really meant. Soldiers in the field were told almost nothing. Early deployment was cautious. The Navy used the fuses first against Japanese aircraft over the Pacific. The results were astonishing. Where gunners had once fired thousands of rounds, now only hundreds or even dozens were needed. Planes that thought they had dodged flak suddenly disintegrated as near misses became lethal. Pilots spoke in fear of impossible explosions that found them no matter how they weaved. The Japanese never discovered the secret. They only felt its bite. But even then, restrictions were strict. The fuse was not to be used over land where duds might be recovered. Commanders feared that if even a single unexploded shell fell into enemy hands, the secret would be unraveled. And so, for months, the fuse remained the invisible hand behind naval victories, whispered about but never explained. Meanwhile, in laboratories and factories across America, production ramped up. By 1943, thousands of workers were assembling fuses in secrecy. Women on assembly lines soldered tiny wires, unaware that the devices they handled would change battlefields across the world. By war's end, millions would be produced, one of the most ambitious electronic manufacturing efforts of the century. Yet the fuse was more than a gadget. It was a shift in philosophy. For the first time, the probability of a kill tilted heavily toward the defender. Aircraft no longer needed to be hit dead-on. Bombers that once flew through curtains of flak with impunity now faced a sky where every shell was a predator. Back on Omaha Beach, a year later, the proximity fuse would prove itself in artillery, detonating shells in the air above German infantry, raining lethal fragments where trenches offered no protection. In the Ardennes, during the desperate German offensive of December 1944, American gunners used the fuse to break massed attacks, cutting down advancing columns before they could even reach American lines. One German officer, captured afterward, confessed that his men had felt the explosions were inhuman, as if the shells knew where we were. But all of that was still to come. In 1942 and 1943, the fuse was still secret, still hidden, still waiting for its moment. The world had not yet seen the full consequences of a weapon that didn't need to hit, only to come close. That moment was coming. And when it arrived, it would prove why the radar proximity fuse was not just another gadget in the arsenal, but the most effective, secret weapon America unleashed in the Second World War. Night seas heaved under blacked-out hulls while gun crews watched the sky with a kind of practiced dread. The Pacific had a sound all its own when aircraft came hunting at dusk. First a tremor in the air, then the faint saw buzz of engines, then the sudden hard stutter of anti-aircraft guns finding their pace. On those decks, men had learned the old arithmetic the hard way. To bring down a single attacker often meant throwing up absurd amounts of steel and smoke and hope. Near misses looked beautiful and meant nothing, until the misses started to matter. The Navy got the new fuse first, cradling it like a secret too sharp to touch. Officially, it was a VT fuse, variable time, a phrase that said almost nothing and hid almost everything. Unofficially, to the handful of officers read into the program, it was the difference between flak that decorated the sky and flak that killed. The rules were strict. Use it at sea, where the odds of a dud washing ashore in enemy hands were slim. Keep it off the beaches and far from any place a fragment might be pulled from a crater and puzzled over by the other side's engineers. When the first batches arrived in the fleet, packed in anonymous crates, signed for with brisk nods and the kind of paperwork that disappears as soon as it's filed, sailors were told only what they needed: handle with care, load as ordered, fire on command. They did, and the sky changed. Picture a cruiser screen in the Solomons, the water a dark hammered plate under a thin knife-edge moon. Radar scopes quiver. The Combat Information Center murmurs coordinates. Topside, directors slew as if sniffing. Then there, dots at the edge, coming fast and low. The first salvos rise, timed by men who used to set mechanical fuses with chilled fingers and nervous speed. But these shells carry something else in their noses, a tiny heartbeat of radio, listening for its own echo. The bursts don't wait for an exact second hand or a direct strike. They feel for proximity, and when their skin tingles with a returning whisper from a wing or fuselage, they answer with fire. Attackers that used to blast through curtains of flak now come apart in ugly, efficient ways. Control cables shredded, tail assemblies chewed to tatters, engines sparked and silenced by shards of steel. Pilots who had trained themselves to weave through predicted firewatch patterns suddenly face explosions that seem to anticipate their moves. The logs fill with phrases like burst near, abrupt loss of control, plane disintegrated, and somewhere below in the magazines a chief smiles, a small private thing, because he knows the shells above are finally worth their weight. Success creates its own pressure. If it works at sea, commanders ask, what about home skies chiseled by bombers and the long, malevolent hum of pilotless aircraft? What about the flying bombs? The pulse jet wasps that skim in at treetop height, cruel in their simplicity? What about every place where defense used to mean thousands of rounds expended for one grudging kill? The fuse moves by stages guarded by secrecy that borders on superstition. In the factories, women with steady hands solder hair-thin leads to subminiature tubes and coil antennas the size of bracelets. They don't know exactly what they're building and don't need to. In proving grounds, technicians in heavy coats tally survivals and failures after guns slam their products into the sky at brutal G-loads. Some fuses die in the barrel, some cough themselves awake too late, some sing perfectly on the first try. The scientists keep polishing the design until the averages make commanders breathe easier. Under the secrecy, there's a second transformation. Less dramatic than aircraft blowing apart, more profound than any one battle report. The proximity fuse quietly resets how defenders think about time and distance. Old anti-aircraft doctrine is a symphony of estimates: range, speed, angle, fuse. Set seconds, lead. You can do the math beautifully and still be betrayed by the way reality refuses to hold still. The new device lifts some of that burden. The round carries its own last instant judgment with it, a sliver of radio that says close enough now. Gunners still aim, directors still compute, radar still paints the target, but the final call is made inside the shell, in the half-heartbeat before steel becomes shrapnel. Sailors notice subtler changes too. The air at the edge of a task force feels different when attackers peel away earlier, when the survivors weave higher to avoid the dense burst field, when torpedo drops go sloppier, because the pilot's confidence has been shaken. After one action, a gun captain says, half in awe and half in fatigue, "They don't like our sky anymore." In his diary, he doesn't bother with the reason. He can't write it down anyway. Secrecy has a logic of its own. The fuse is held back from land combat, not because it wouldn't help. Every artilleryman on the line could tell you what a true airburst would do to troops in the open or to men who trust a trench roof to catch fragments, but because a single intact example in the wrong hands could unravel years of work. Commanders make compromises that look like hesitations to anyone not holding the brief. Use it over the ocean, where a dud dives to its death. Use it against pilotless aircraft, where the debris field lies on friendly soil and cleanup crews can be thorough. Keep it away from the churned front lines, where the ground's appetite for secrets is never as deep as you hope. Still, rumors grow legs. Crews give the shells nicknames they won't repeat outside the gun deck. Pilots invent superstitions to explain why their friends didn't come home. Somewhere, an enemy intelligence officer files a report full of half-truths and guesses. Somewhere else, a scientist reads between the lines of casualty tables and probability graphs and feels the shape of a device he's never seen. That's the risk of results. Reality leaks. Then come the flying bombs, the low angry drones racing over the water and hedgerows, engines coughing like distant chainsaws. Defenders learn to read their sound the way farmers read weather. The old tools work, fighters that slide in, tip a wing under a wing to crash them or shoot them from safe angles. Guns that blacken the sky in their path, barrage balloons that force a detour, but the numbers aren't where commanders want them. The proximity fuse enters that battle like a quiet professional. Radar points batteries where to aim, directors push barrels to the right lead, and the shells decide their own moment to bloom. Interception rates jump in ways that turn hands-on-hip skepticism into satisfied nods. The threat doesn't end. The enemy keeps sending the drones, but the calculus shifts. Fewer cross the line. Fewer reach the city. Sleep returns, not perfectly, but in longer pieces. At sea, the enemy adapts. Attacks come in more complex patterns, with dive bombers and torpedo planes trying to saturate the defense, and later, pilots who intend to die turning their aircraft into guided shrapnel. The fuse does not solve everything, no weapon does, but it changes the shape of every approach vector. Air crews must respect a broader, deadlier radius of danger. That means releasing higher, turning earlier, or screaming in so wildly that accuracy collapses. Each adjustment saves ships and kills attackers by a second-order effect. Fear of the sky you used to game. Meanwhile, inside the shell's nose, the place where all these behaviors converge, miniature miracles keep stacking up. A battery that sleeps until setback jolts it awake. A tiny oscillator that hums into the void. An antenna that's no bigger than a coil of wire in a boy's pocket but ready to taste its own echo. A therotron or similar trigger that waits like a coiled fist for the beat frequency to say, "Target skin is here." All of it potted in compound, the whole fragile cathedral frozen so it can survive the world's worst catapult ride. There's an elegance to it that never shows up in parades. No one pins a ribbon on a vacuum tube. On the decks and in the pits, the talk centers on outcomes, a destroyer that once watched attackers leak through its defensive screen, now has after-action reports that tally kills with less embarrassment. A battery that used to ask for more shells to do the same job can suddenly do it with fewer. Less heat in the barrels, less time with crews and exposure. More flexibility to shift guns from sky to shore and back again as the day demands. Logistics officers notice, and when logistics smiles, strategy listens. When the fuse finally crosses the last red line and goes to ground combat in earnest, it does so because the calculus of risk changes. The fear of capture remains, but the need outweighs it. There is a winter battle where the woods turn into razor wire of bare branches and snow-hardened sound into a cruel, bright thing. Men in white smocks move through the trees with confidence born from hard practice. Commanders on the defending side look at their own battered maps and decide the sky must bend to the ground. Guns that used to scatter fragments against trunks and dirt now pluck an altitude out of the air and make it lethal. The first shells detonate 10-20 yards above the advance, and the effect is as much moral as physical. A trench protects you from lateral blast. It laughs at a vertical storm only once. After that, every man looks up when he should be looking forward. Artillery officers who learned their craft on time-set fuses feel a twinge of disloyalty as they fall in love with a device that renders a portion of their art obsolete. They get over it quickly. You can be a romantic about technique, or you can be a professional about results. Units that had trained to walk barrage ladders now adjust to a new rhythm. Radar or observers call, directors solve, batteries unspool. The shells take their private vote at the top and bloom above the unlucky. In the diaries that survive, some gunners confess that the first time they watched a column dissolve under airbursts, they felt a little sick afterward. In letters that never made it past the censor, a few put it more bluntly. It feels like cheating. Commanders remind them gently that war is not a duel, it's an economy, and economies reward efficiency. The enemy is not slow. Even as their resources thin, they try to adapt. Spacing changes, formations melt into thinner lines, armored roofs appear over positions that used to trust the open. Camouflage gets more ambitious. But there's only so much you can do when the thing you fear is invisible and patient. You can't silence a fuse with a trick. You can only shorten the time you spend under the sky it rules. That means moving at night. And nights are not as dark as they used to be. On the production side, the story becomes a kind of quiet epic. Factory towns add second shifts. A train pulls out with crates that are deliberately boring to look at. At the end of the line, there's a ship. And after the ship, there's a magazine stacked just so. And after that, there's a loader with a practiced palm and a director calling deflection. And then there's only the sky and a decision made in less than the blink it takes to watch it. The scale is staggering. Millions of devices, each a tiny wager that will never be named. Some fail and break hearts. Most work and save lives. Someone always asks, why call it America's most effective secret weapon? When the war had so many champions already, code-breaking rooms humming like beehives, radar webs across coasts, tanks that grew better teeth with each model letter, aircraft that rewrote maps by range alone? The best answers are unsatisfying, which is how you know they're honest. Because effectiveness is not just measured in singular shocks that make headlines. Sometimes it's the change that spreads sideways, quiet and stubborn, until it owns the background. The proximity fuse didn't just win moments, it thickened the air with consequence everywhere it appeared. It made defensive perimeters crueler to violate. It turned every near miss into a maybe, and then into a yes. It multiplied the value of every radar plot and every director's equation. It speeded the moment when attackers decided today was not the day. There's also the matter of what it kept hidden. The enemy never fielded a device of equal maturity in time to change the curve. That wasn't an accident. A doctrine of use enforced by commanders and a culture of secrecy enforced by everyone from scientists to sailors denied the other side the captured clues they would have needed. When fragments did fall into the wrong places, they were rarely the right ones. Twists of metal and glass that set electronics in the obvious way and impossible in the details. By the time anyone might have caught up, the war had run ahead. And yet, listen closely to veterans decades later and you'll notice how soft their voices get when they talk about it. Not out of fear, classification stamps fade, but out of respect. They'll describe nights when the sky erupted at just the right distance and days when the tree line went from cover to hazard. They'll say it saved ships and broke attacks and shortened battles. They'll admit, some of them, that they didn't know what it was at the time, only that the burst looked different and the aftermath was quieter. A few will tell you about the first time they saw a fuse on a workbench after the war, how small it looked, how homely, how unlike a thing that could intimidate aircraft and rewrite artillery tables. They'll laugh at the difference between a legend and a circuit. Then they'll go quiet again because they remember why legends start. By late war, the fuse is everywhere commanders dare to use it. On picket destroyers guarding fast carriers from sudden knives out of a blue sky, on cruisers screening bombardment groups that turn shore batteries into archaeology. In gun pits where maps shake from the recoil and the sky answers with glittering falling hail. The language of after-action reports evolves almost without anyone noticing. Premature used to be a curse that meant a shell robbed of purpose. Now it's a technical curiosity in a sea of airburst effective. Heavy expenditure used to cloak failure in busyness. Now officers talk in sleeker terms: rounds per kill, missions per corridor cleared, minutes shaved off an attack's useful life. There are still days when nothing seems to work because war never loses all its chaos. Weather lies, circuits die, men make the wrong turn and pay for it. But the baseline has moved. The floor under failure is higher, the ceiling above success is lifted, and in between there's a steadiness that planners love. You can plan on a thing that multiplies probabilities wherever you put it. You can build operations on top of a device that makes everyone else better. Radar crews, fire control teams, gunners, even the men who have to sprint across a field that will be a storm in 10 seconds. The proximity fuse is an amplifier disguised as a gadget. If you want a single image to hold in your head for what changed in these months, picture a young pilot rolling his aircraft on final approach to a ship he means to kill. He's trained his hands to ignore the tracers, to believe in a gap that used to exist. He lines up, commits, rides the tunnel in. And then something blooms before he expects it, not where a stopwatch would put it, but where his skin and wings are. He yanks without thinking, the angle spoils, the water comes up too fast, and the ship he meant to strike still lives to launch and land more planes, to throw more punches. Multiply that moment by hundreds, by thousands, and you understand why the men on deck start to believe the sky is theirs again. The fuse doesn't end the war. No single thing does. But by the time it has stretched its reach from ocean to home front to frozen forests and hedgerows, it has earned the adjective that seems too big until you measure it against results: decisive. It turns the old desperation of gunnery into a practiced craft with a new merciful edge. It gives weary crews back minutes and odds they thought the world had taken from them. And it does it while pretending to be just another piece of steel in a world groaning with it. One day, not long after the last big pushes, the classification stamps will fade and the program files will find their way into histories. People will argue about superlatives because that's what we do when the smoke clears. But down in the footnotes, you'll see the numbers change when the device shows up, and on the faces of the men who knew it only by the difference it made, you'll see something simpler: relief. In a war that demanded so much contact, men against men, metal against metal, the most effective weapon, in some fights, turned out to be the one that didn't need to touch at all. Close enough was finally close enough. Snow fell on the Ardennes in a way that seemed almost cruel because it muffled sound while amplifying fear. The trees stood bare and black against the white ground, branches clawing at the pale sky. In December 1944, German forces launched their last great gamble, an offensive meant to break the Allied line, split armies, and reclaim initiative. They drove through the forest with armor and infantry, catching defenders off guard, rolling across frozen roads with engines that growled like predators. The Americans, scattered and thin, fought to hold on. It was a battle where every trench, every crossroads, every gun mattered. Into this desperate landscape, the proximity fuse came ashore. For months, commanders had resisted its use over land. The risk of capture, the terror of an intact fuse falling into enemy hands, outweighed even the potential benefit. But in December, those equations shifted. The Germans were massing forces with a boldness not seen since the opening days of the war. American infantry braced against columns of tanks. Villages turned into death traps. Forests echoed with artillery duels. The stakes were too high. The fuse was released for ground combat. The first reports sounded almost like exaggeration. Artillery units fitted their shells with the new device, fired into advancing German formations, and watched the effect with stunned satisfaction. Where once shells had buried themselves into snow or soil before exploding, their force blunted by the earth, now they detonated in the air, 10, 20 yards above the target. The difference was night and day. Fragments showered downward in wide cones, slicing through helmets, coats, flesh. Trenches that once provided safety now trapped men beneath lethal rain. Columns marching in confidence broke apart under invisible storms. German survivors told the same story over and over. They felt as if the shells were alive, as if they knew exactly where to burst. One officer described the effect as inhuman, as though the enemy commanded the air itself. Soldiers who had endured artillery before, who had learned to dig deep, cover their heads, wait it out, found that their old defenses meant nothing. The snow reflected the blasts, amplifying the sense of total exposure. Men crouched in foxholes looked up, terrified, knowing the sky itself might betray them. American gunners were equally stunned. They had spent years training with time-set fuses, twisting knobs, reading charts, doing math in the middle of chaos. They had cursed the seconds lost, the miscalculations that wasted rounds, the shells that exploded too soon or too late. Now, with proximity fuses, they saw efficiency leap forward. Whole batteries delivered air bursts with uncanny precision. Kill zones grew wider. Ammunition was used more effectively. Commanders began to calculate new patterns of fire, confident that the shells themselves would do the last second of work. A lieutenant remembered his first fire mission with the new fuses. We braced for the usual, a few explosions, the Germans scattering but regrouping. Instead, it was like lightning cracked open right above them. I could see men diving for cover and still getting cut down. I thought, this changes everything. The psychological impact was profound. German troops began to whisper about magic shells. Some believed the Americans had found a way to aim at individual men. Rumors spread through units like infection. Veterans who had fought through years of bombardment found themselves shaken in ways they hadn't been before. Fear spread faster than shrapnel, and in war, fear kills momentum as surely as bullets. Doctrinally, the change was equally dramatic. American field manuals had taught that to clear trenches, you needed direct hits or heavy bombardment. With proximity fuses, one shell could do the work of many. To disrupt massed infantry, commanders had relied on saturation fire, expending vast amounts of ammunition to create a statistical chance of hits. Now, fewer rounds sufficed. Batteries could shift fire faster, respond to calls with more flexibility. The entire tempo of artillery support quickened. At Bastogne, Where the 101st Airborne held out under siege, the fuse proved decisive. German assaults that might have rolled over weary paratroopers stalled under the sudden effectiveness of supporting fire. Every time enemy troops tried to mass for an attack, airbursts shredded their ranks before they even reached the perimeter. Veterans later credited the fuse with helping to hold the line until relief arrived. "It was like we had angels in the sky," one paratrooper said. "The shells burst right above the Krauts' heads every time." Even beyond the Ardennes, the fuse altered campaigns. In the hedgerows of Normandy, artillery with proximity fuses blasted through thickets and concealed positions, showering defenders who thought themselves safe. In the crossing of the Rhine, barrages softened resistance with terrifying precision. By 1945, wherever American artillery fired, the enemy learned to fear not only the ground but the air above it. Production surged to meet demand. Factories in the United States turned out millions of fuses, each one a small miracle of electronics ruggedized to endure the impossible. Workers still knew little about what they were building. They soldered, coiled, packed, and shipped, never imagining that their handiwork was exploding in forests half a world away, breaking assaults, saving comrades they'd never meet. Historians would later call it one of the greatest feats of industrial coordination in history, rivaling the Manhattan Project in scope, though not in fame. Secrecy persisted, though cracks appeared. By 1945, fragments of fuses inevitably fell into enemy hands. But the Germans, crippled by shortages of materials and time, never managed to replicate them effectively. Their scientists understood the principles but could not overcome the engineering hurdles quickly enough. The war was already tilting, the tide already rolling inland across their shattered Reich. The secret remained an American edge until it no longer mattered. For the soldiers who benefited, the proximity fuse became less a piece of technology and more a kind of reassurance. In letters home, some hinted at new tricks the artillery was using. In diaries, gunners described the satisfaction of watching an advancing line scatter under invisible bursts. Few wrote down details, they didn't know them, and censors would never allow it, but the tone was clear. They felt they had been given a gift. The Germans, by contrast, grew fatalistic. Accounts from prisoners show despair at facing artillery that seemed omniscient. "There was no cover," one wrote. "You could not hide from it. You waited, and the sky opened, and men died." That sense of helplessness eroded morale in ways no conventional weapon could. The doctrine of combined arms also shifted subtly. Infantry, who had once distrusted artillery support, knowing that barrages often fell late or imprecise, began to fight with new confidence. They knew their artillery could shatter counterattacks before they closed. Armor units, too, moved more boldly when they knew advancing enemy infantry would be cut down from above. The fuse didn't just kill, it accelerated the entire machine of war. Commanders noted another advantage: economy. With fewer shells needed for the same effect, supply lines breathed easier. Ammunition expenditure remained high, as war always demanded, but the ratio of effort to effect improved markedly. That efficiency saved tonnage on ships, space on trucks, time in depots. Wars are won not only on the battlefield but in the quiet math of logistics, and in that math, the fuse was a quiet revolution. By spring 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany, the proximity fuse was everywhere. Batteries unleashed storms of airbursts that stripped defenders from hillsides and towns. German counterattacks faltered before they reached Allied lines. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, found its last sorties cut down by naval and field guns armed with the same invisible edge. The weapon had gone from guarded secret to common arm, and its reputation had grown accordingly. Soldiers whispered of it with reverence, even when they barely understood it. For them, it was proof that science and war, when fused, could produce miracles. Historians later argued about rankings. Was the fuse truly the most effective secret weapon of the war, greater even than radar or code breaking? Opinions differed, but few denied its impact. It saved lives by making defenses stronger, shortened battles by breaking assaults faster, and terrified enemies by rendering old defenses useless. Its true measure was not in headlines, but in the countless unnamed soldiers who lived because of it. By the end, the proximity fuse had done more than change battles. It had changed the psychology of combat itself. Soldiers no longer trusted the sky. Near misses were no longer safe. The very geometry of war had shifted. Up and down mattered as much as front and back. And in that geometry, America had claimed an edge that bent the course of history. By the spring of 1945, Europe had become a battlefield of ruins. German cities smoldered under relentless bombing, bridges lay in twisted heaps, and the Wehrmacht fought on with the stubbornness of a force that knew the end was coming, but refused to bow. The Allies pressed across the Rhine, tearing into the industrial heart of the Reich. At every stage, artillery prepared the way, and in the noses of countless shells fired in those final campaigns, the proximity fuse hummed its tiny, deadly signal. Crossing the Rhine was one of the war's most audacious feats. Amphibious landings, pontoon bridges, and airborne drops turned the river, once considered a final defensive barrier, into a crossing point. German defenders lined the far bank with machine guns, mortars, and artillery, yet when American and British gunners unleashed barrages armed with proximity fuses, the effect was devastating. Shells burst above dugouts and trenches, shredding troops who thought themselves safe. Resistance collapsed faster than expected. Units that might have held for days were broken in hours. The Rhine crossing, once feared as a potential bloodbath, succeeded with fewer losses than planners had dared hope. Commanders later admitted that the fuse had given them confidence to attempt maneuvers that might otherwise have seemed reckless. Further east, as Allied armies raced toward Berlin, artillery once again played its grim part. Proximity fuses detonated over crossroads and choke points, harassing retreating German columns, scattering reserves before they could organize. Bridges blown by German engineers were met with counter-barrages that pinned sappers before they could finish their work. Again and again, German diaries spoke of despair. "The shells burst above us, always above us," one soldier wrote. "No trench was deep enough. We felt naked to the sky." It was not just the physical toll, but the psychological weight that mattered. Morale, already brittle, shattered. In Italy, on secondary fronts, the same story unfolded. Mountain passes, long considered artillery nightmares, were softened by shells that could burst in ravines and over slopes, striking where ordinary rounds would have buried themselves uselessly in rock. In France, during mop-up operations, pockets of German resistance discovered that walls and roofs offered no sanctuary from airbursts. The fuse was everywhere now, no longer confined to secret use, but the Germans never produced a true countermeasure. They lacked the time, materials, and industrial base to replicate it. The war was ending too fast. Across the globe in the Pacific, the fuse's story reached its final, brutal chapters. Japanese kamikazes had turned the seas around Okinawa into a nightmare. Pilots hurled themselves at ships, willing to die if they could take an aircraft carrier or destroyer with them. Anti-aircraft fire became the last, desperate defense. Crews braced as waves of planes descended, knowing even one slip could mean annihilation. Into this terror stepped the proximity fuse. Shells armed with it created lethal walls in the sky. Kamikazes that might have plunged through ordinary barrages instead exploded in mid-air, torn apart by fragments from near-miss bursts. Ships that might have been struck were spared. Though many vessels were still lost in that bloody campaign, survivors credited the fuse with saving dozens more. For the sailors who endured Okinawa, it was a weapon that turned suicide attacks into gambles the enemy could not always win. As the Pacific War moved toward its climax, the fuse remained central. Against Japanese artillery in the Philippines, American batteries used airbursts to crush dug-in positions. Against infantry attacks on islands, airbursts decimated banzai charges before they closed with defenders. The fuse shortened battles, saved lives, and added another edge to America's overwhelming material superiority. It was not the only weapon that drove Japan to defeat. The atomic bomb would cast the longest shadow, but it was among the quietest and most effective. Then came victory. Germany surrendered in May 1945, Japan in August. The guns fell silent, and with silence came reflection. Slowly, the cloak of secrecy around the proximity fuse began to lift. At first, only hints appeared in press briefings, a new device that had aided victory, a technical innovation that multiplied the power of artillery. Soon, journalists pieced together more. In December 1945, the U.S. Army and Navy formally acknowledged the existence of the fuse. Newspapers ran headlines calling it the second greatest secret of the war after the atomic bomb. Photographs of the tiny device inside a shell nose astonished readers. How could something so small have wielded so much power? Historians and scientists weighed in. They marveled at the engineering: vacuum tubes ruggedized to survive launch, batteries activated by setback forces, circuits able to detect Doppler shifts in flight. They noted the production miracle: millions of devices built in secret, assembled by workers who never knew their purpose. They praised the secrecy itself, a weapon so effective that commanders dared not risk its capture until the war's closing months. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, declared the proximity fuse to be one of the most important developments of the war. Admiral Lewis Strauss later called it decisive. Praise piled high, yet the weapon remained overshadowed in popular memory by radar, code-breaking, and the atomic bomb, perhaps because it lacked spectacle, perhaps because it was designed never to be seen except in the instant of destruction. It never captured the public imagination in the same way. But within the military, its legacy was profound. Artillery doctrine was rewritten. Airbursts became standard, not rare miracles of well-set time fuses. Training emphasized the new efficiency. Logistics planning assumed fewer shells per mission. The Cold War dawned with armies equipped to fight under skies where proximity fuses made every barrage more lethal. From Korea to Vietnam, from NATO exercises in Europe to desert campaigns decades later, the principle endured. Newer electronics replaced vacuum tubes, radar gave way to solid-state circuits, but the core idea remained. Near was good enough. The fuse had rewritten the mathematics of firepower. For veterans, the memory of its first use lingered. Sailors recalled the moment kamikazes disintegrated in mid-air. Infantrymen remembered German attacks dissolving under airbursts in the Ardennes. Artillerymen remembered the satisfaction of watching rounds burst exactly where they were needed, no longer trusting to luck. Many admitted they hadn't understood the technology at the time. They just knew something had changed, something that made survival more likely. For them, that was miracle enough. On the other side, German and Japanese veterans carried different memories. They remembered the despair of trenches that no longer protected, the fear of skies that seemed alive, the helplessness of fighting an enemy whose shells burst with uncanny precision. Some refused to believe it was merely electronics. They insisted it was sorcery or some monstrous trick. Others simply acknowledged it as one more edge in a war where the Allies had many. For them, it was proof that technology had tilted the scales irrevocably. In the decades since, historians have debated superlatives. Was the proximity fuse truly the most effective secret weapon of the war? The atomic bomb ended it. Radar won the Battle of Britain. Code-breaking shaped entire campaigns. Yet in terms of scale, ubiquity, and the sheer number of lives saved and battles influenced, many argue that the fuse belongs near the top of the list. It was never glamorous, never dramatic, but it worked everywhere it was used, and it multiplied the effectiveness of countless other systems. It was a force multiplier in the truest sense. Today, the legacy of the proximity fuse is still visible. Modern artillery, missiles, and even bombs use advanced versions of the same principle. Sensors that detect when a target is near and detonate at the right moment. The sleek electronics of the 21st century trace their lineage back to the fragile vacuum tubes potted in wax inside 1940 shells. Every time a missile bursts near its target, every time an airburst shell scatters fragments over a formation, the echo of that wartime invention lives on. On Memorial Days, veterans sometimes gather at cemeteries and monuments. Among the stories they tell, the long marches, the sudden ambushes, the faces of friends lost, there are mentions of the fuse. Not often, not with the grandeur reserved for famous battles, but with a quiet respect, They remember how it felt to see the sky suddenly favor them. They remember how it saved lives when lives seemed cheap. They remember that in a war defined by contact, man against man, steel against steel, it was a weapon that proved you didn't need to touch to kill. And so, the proximity fuse, once the most closely guarded secret, lives in history with a paradox. It was small, almost invisible, hidden in the nose of a shell. It was massive, reshaping battles and bending campaigns. It was feared, respected, sometimes misunderstood. It was never the star of propaganda reels, never the headline in victory parades, but in the quiet calculations of war, it was decisive. Soldiers in the Ardennes knew it. Sailors at Okinawa knew it. Generals drawing arrows across maps knew it. And today anyone who studies the war closely knows it too. When the war ended, the world wanted stories of atomic fire and radar screens glowing in the night. But in the silence after those stories, another truth waited. A truth of tiny radios, fragile tubes, hidden miracles. A truth that explained why near misses suddenly became hits, why trenches became coffins, why planes fell from skies that once spared them. A truth that said victory sometimes comes not from the loudest weapon, but from the one that whispers until it kills. That truth was the proximity fuse. America's most effective secret weapon.